Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Introduction to Confucianism, Living with Kindness and Propriety, a presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is Thomas Dezash, and I will be your lecturer for our discussion today. To begin our conversation about Confucius, we should begin with the person of Confucius. His actual name was Kongzi. Confucius is an English mispronunciation of his name. His dates were 551 to 479 BCE. He lived during a period of Chinese history called the Warring States period. Now, during this time period, China was in a state of extreme political turmoil. There was no real unified China at that time, and many smaller city-states were vying for political and financial control of larger and larger areas, hence the name the Warring States period. That was the world into which Confucius was born. He was born poor, but he managed to receive an excellent education. He was, from all accounts, a very gifted student. He was a polymath, meaning that he excelled in multiple academic disciplines. He studied ritual, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, math, poetry, history, and music, just to name a few of the many subjects at which he excelled. Once he finished his education, he set himself up as a private teacher and started teaching students of his own. He taught in a way very similar to the Greek Socrates, favoring conversation and provocative questions in his interactions with his students. Confucius looked around at the world in the Warring States period, and he saw a world that was marked by social chaos and unrest. And this was the problem to which he dedicated his life. He was looking for a way to create social harmony. As such, Confucius and the subsequent practice or tradition that followed him, Confucianism, is really concerned more with this world than with some other world or afterlife. Confucianism doesn't really address very much about what happens after death. Certainly, Confucianism holds, just as any other Chinese tradition would, that there are ancestors and that those ancestors need to be venerated. But beyond that consideration, Confucius really doesn't get into, quote unquote, an afterlife. A lot of Confucius writings are pointing towards a Chinese golden age, which he associated with a time period when a large portion of China was ruled by a group referred to as the Dukes of Zhou. This would have been during the Zhou dynasty. And it extended into his own lifetime. There were still descendants of the Dukes of Zhou. But when he spoke about the Dukes of Zhou, he really was referring to the early Dukes of Zhou, so close to 1,000 years BCE. And these Dukes of Zhou were believed to have been sort of enlightened sage rulers. They were virtuous, benevolent rulers who understood their place in the world. They understood their place in the universe and their relationship to their subjects. They were, for all intents and purposes, gifted and excellent rulers. And these were the models which Confucius took as his exemplars for what society should look like and how human beings should treat one another. As a result of his views on the Dukes of Zhou and their golden age, if you will, Confucius constructed a worldview really centered on the importance of education. But it wasn't just any old education. Confucius believed that everyone needed to be educated in the five classics. These are five texts or collections of texts that exist from Chinese antiquity and which Confucius felt really informed a worldview that would lead to social harmony and to virtuous human living. The five classics are the I Ching, the Book of Documents, the Book of Odes, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Now, the I Ching, more commonly known as the Book of Changes, was an extremely ancient text that was used for divination. This was a text that really explored the relationship between human beings and the world around them. It also really explored the relationship between human beings and Tian, or heaven, which in Confucianism and in Chinese religious traditions in general is a concept that really applies more to universal order than anything else. When we talk about heaven or Tian, we are talking about the cosmic law or the natural order which all things must follow. And so the I Ching was a way in which people could divine the will of heaven and better understand their relationship to heaven. The Book of Documents is a collection of historical texts that really explain and recount the stories of the Dukes of Zhou. The Book of Odes is a book of poetry. So we see here that Confucius views an awareness of poetry and literature as being central to the education of what is called a junzi, or an exemplary person, a person who supports harmonious society. The Book of Rites deals with proper etiquette and ritual. This really is a text that talks about how it is that human beings should enact rituals that align us with the will of heaven, with Tian. So these were rites in which the ruler might reenact the movement of the stars through the sky, or might make offerings to particular deities, or might even make offerings to Tian, to heaven itself, so that the world remained in its proper order. Finally, the Spring and Autumn Annals are a collection of narratives of historical events in ancient China. Confucius really felt that the well-rounded and virtuous person, again, that is called the junzi, that they needed this kind of an education in order to develop real character. And the development of that character became codified into the idea of the five Confucian virtues. Now, the five virtues are Ren, which means benevolence or kindness, Li, which means propriety or etiquette, Yi, which means integrity, Ji, knowledge, and Xin, honesty. Confucius felt that these five virtues needed to be trained and fully developed in a human being in order for them to become a full human being, again, a junzi, the exemplary person. The pursuit of this kind of education came to be called rujia, or the school of the scholars. And this is what in English, in modern language, we call Confucianism. In traditional China, Confucianism was referred to as the school of the scholars, or rujia. And this would have been anyone who followed those teachings laid down by Confucius, which focused on the development of becoming a Junzi and establishing social harmony. Confucius believed that in order to create a stable and harmonious society, the first step was to create harmonious people. There's kind of a notion in Confucianism that you start at the most basic level, which is yourself, and that from there, society will become good. If you can become good, the people around you will become good, and as people become good, a village becomes good, a city becomes good, a country becomes good, the world becomes good. So Confucius laid out this model of the noble person or the exemplary person called the Junzi. In order to become a Junzi, a person needed to develop virtue, which we already discussed, those 5 Confucian virtues. They needed to understand that the cultivation of virtue within themselves was the same thing as cultivating those virtues within society at large. Most importantly, Confucius believed that you could not cultivate those 5 virtues alone in a cave. You needed other people in order to cultivate yourself as a Junzi. One cannot develop Ren, which is benevolence or kindness, alone. In order to develop benevolence and kindness, you need other human beings with whom you can act in a kind manner. Confucius also believed that it was essential, if a person was to develop strong character, that they develop an education. And particularly, they needed to develop an education in the context of those 5 classics that we just discussed. Finally, the Junzi needed to learn how to avoid extremes. This is what Confucius referred to as the doctrine of the mean. And by avoiding extremes, I mean that Confucius taught his students that too much excitement, too much depression were not good things. People needed to be level and balanced. They needed not to be swayed by their passions, whether that was passion for love, passion for lust, or by passions of negativity, anger, hatred, greed. Any of those things, in Confucius' view, would lead a person away from the development of virtue and therefore lead them away from becoming a Junzi. He also felt that these extremes of passion, greed, anger, these were central to why society itself was in such a state of chaos during his lifetime. So he advocated for his followers to develop the doctrine of the mean, in which they avoided those kind of extreme reactions and responses. Another concept that's central in any understanding of Chinese religious belief is filial piety. And there are 2 points within filial piety that I want to raise. The first I've already talked about a little bit, which is ancestor veneration, and I will come back to that after I talk about the other, which is the 5 relationships. Confucius said that there was sort of a natural order to how our relationships with other people work. And to that end, he laid out 5 model relationships. And in laying out these relationships, he explained how the 2 parties in each relationship were supposed to interact with one another. So the 5 relationships are: first, ruler to subject; second, father to son; third, husband to wife; fourth, elder brother to younger brother; and fifth, friend to friend. Now you may already notice that within those 5 relationships, there is an implication that one of those 2 parties must be higher on the social totem pole than the other. Of course, the ruler is superior to the subject. In the Chinese cultural awareness, a father is superior to the son. Similarly, in the Chinese social construct, husbands would have been superior to their wives. We see this in many ancient cultures. Elder brothers would have been superior to their younger brothers, and friends generally we could understand as being an equal relationship, but the implication again here is that one friend probably has a stronger or higher social standing than the other. So, what does Confucius tell us about the nature of these relationships? With ruler to subject, what he tells us is that the ruler should always be kind, the ruler should govern with justice, and the ruler should train himself to be a junzi as well. Because if the ruler is a noble person, if the ruler exemplifies or typifies virtue, then the subjects will follow that example. The subjects are expected to be obedient to anything that the ruler asks. They are not to challenge the ruler. They are not to rebel against the ruler. They are to be good followers. The same is true of the father-son relationship. The father is the ruler within the family. The son is the subject. Same thing with husband and wife. The father or the husband is the ruler. The wife becomes subject. So we see that this model of ruler and subject really kind of trickles down through all levels of society. It goes from the very top, which is the ruler of the kingdom, and then trickles down into the governor of a province or the governor of a city, and then it trickles down further into individual households where the father and husband sits as the ruler over the rest of the family. The model of elder brother, younger brother doesn't only apply to family situations, it also applies to trade situations and social situations. For example, if two people were both students in the same school, the student who had been there longer would be considered the elder brother, and the younger brother would be the student who had been there less time. And there the relationship, again, is similar to the ruler and subject. The elder brother has authority over the younger brother. Within the friend-friend relationship, Confucius explains to us maybe the best model for equity in relationship. Because even though one friend may have more social standing than the other, most of the conversations that Confucius has about friendship seem to really indicate a level playing field in which people are to practice ren in particular. Ren, again, is benevolence or kindness. So within the friend-friend relationship, we see maybe the most immediate example of how all five of the virtues can be practiced in a very practical and direct fashion. Now, I said I would circle back and talk about ancestor worship again here. And the reason I wanted to talk about the five relationships first is because ancestor worship falls within this model. Certainly, the ancestors serve as father. They serve in that same capacity as father. They are those who have come before. They are more senior to us. So everyone in the family pays their respects to the ancestors in the same way that a son shows respect to his father. It's another way in which Confucius expresses this notion of filial piety. Ancestor worship had existed as a concept within China for centuries, if not millennia, before Confucius. But Confucius brought that idea of ancestor worship in to his own worldview and teaching because it provided an incredibly good example of filial piety. Again, these are structures through which Confucius was expressing a way to structure society so that society would be harmonious and so that society would function without any kind of conflict or trouble. These were the ways in which Confucius imagined a well oiled social machine. Now, Confucius was followed by many great thinkers who were students of his or students of students. And one of the biggest conversations that went on in generations after Confucius' death were conversations around the goodness of human beings. And we see two major voices emerge within this conversation. And anytime we talk about Confucianism, we can't avoid discussing this particular question because the two thinkers that really explored this question are so important and so integral to a discussion of Confucianism that they always turn up. So I would like to take us down that road next. The first thinker that we can look at in relationship to this question of are human beings inherently good is Menchus, or Menchus. His dates were 372 to 289 before the Common Era. He is often referred to as the second sage of Confucianism, or sometimes even as the second Confucius. And it was Menchus' argument that human beings are inherently good. Now, Menchus did not ever come out and say human beings are good. He said human beings have the inherent nature to be good. Menchus never suggested that human beings just magically are always good and kind. What Menchus said was that there is within every human being an inborn seed of goodness. But he said that those seeds needed to be nurtured. They needed to be watered and cared for so that they could sprout and burst into blossom. Menchus argued that goodness was always present in a latent state within us. And as an example, he created a thought experiment. He said, imagine that you're walking through the center of the village and you see a small child playing near the edge of a well. Now imagine that that small child begins to lose its balance and starts to fall into the well. All human beings would have the immediate response to rush to the child and catch them. Menchus says that this is proof for the innate goodness of human beings, because he says that that urge, that impetus to reach out and grab that child comes from a place of instinct. It is not something that we step back and consider before we do it. Menchus says that we're not motivated in that moment by praise. We're not motivated by reward. We are motivated purely by an instinctual need to protect the child. This is his central argument for the innate goodness of human beings, but there are others that he brings up throughout the text associated with him, which bears his name. It is called the Menchus, and I've listed it in the additional readings for this lecture. If you're interested, you can find a copy of the Menchus pretty easily, and some of the best examples for this argument are in Book 6a, Book 2a, and Book 7b. In direct opposition to Menchus' view is the view of Shenzhen. Shenzhen's dates are 310 to 235 BCE. Shunzi argues that human beings are inherently evil and that virtue must be learned. Whereas Menchus believes that goodness is an innate quality that lies dormant within us in the form of seeds, Shunzi says that all that is present within us are seeds of wickedness, and that the only way that goodness can be created or enacted within a person is if it is taught to them. Shunzi says that we are like a lump of clay. On its own, it's not much, but in the hands of a skillful potter, clay can become many, many things. Many different kinds of vessels can be created from that lump of clay if the hands of the potter are skilled enough. He was very critical of Menchus' view, saying that what he saw in human beings was an innate need for self-aggrandizement, an innate desire for pleasure, and a general selfishness. He said that you needed look no further than small children who really haven't been taught. By small children, he meant infants. And Shunzi said that infants just cry and want to be fed. They're not kind. They are completely and totally self-absorbed. He said that this, for him, was proof enough that that's what we come into the world with, is just a desire to be cared for and fed and clothed. Historically, Shunzi was criticized for questioning Menchus. In traditional China and in traditional Confucian circles of thought, Menchus was viewed as being such a great person and such a great thinker that Shunzi's criticisms of him were viewed as being very problematic. However, in more recent years, many scholars, both in China and outside of China, have really gone back and looked at Shunzi's writings, and he has received a reprieve, if you will. People really feel that Shunzi's writings are very, very well argued, very well thought out, and that in fact Shunzi is every bit as great a philosopher as was Menchus. So in more recent years, he has come to be seen as a very viable alternative to Menchus' views. Again, the text associated with Shunzi is called the Shunzi, and if you'd like to read more of his arguments, you could look at section 23 of the Shunzi, which I've also listed in your additional readings. So both of those views really are asking a rich question, I think, about the nature of human beings. Confucius argued that in order for society to be good, human beings had to embrace their own virtue. They had to find a way to become exemplary human beings. Both Menchus and Shunzi agree with Confucius. Both of them say that goodness must be cultivated. The major difference between the two is that Menchus argues that that goodness is already present and it just needs to be cared for. Shunzi argues that that goodness is not inherently present, must be introduced into the equation. Both of them, however, agree that this has been an introduction to Confucianism, living with kindness and propriety, a presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is Thomas Dezash, and I will see you next time. Thank you.